right, let's get started. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Trina Shanks. I am Director of Community Engagement at the University of Michigan School of Social Work and a professor here. I use the pronoun she, her, hers. I'm a person wearing glasses. I have short curly hair. I'm African American. I have a black blazer with a black turtleneck on today. If you hit CC or closed captioning or show subtitle at the bottom, you can activate captions. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can toggle between gallery and speaker view. So you can see just the PowerPoint slide and who is talking, if that makes it easier for you to focus. We have a very special session today exploring how equity is tied to transit and also pedestrian-friendly infrastructure. And I want to remind all of the panelists and the students who are part of the Engage community discourse that you can stay after the session for a 30-minute debrief when the official program is done, and everybody else will then log off. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to give a brief land and labor acknowledgement. Engage is aware that we function within a society that has a deep history of exploitation, stealing both the land and labor that has affected and shaped our Indigenous and Black communities for generations. We are committed to acknowledging this in everything we do and help create a more inclusive tomorrow. So I'll take a few minutes to allow you to read this land and labor acknowledgement before we continue. Thank you. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to introduce you to our Engage team. And I don't see it on my screen yet, but maybe everyone else sees it. I'll just keep on going. Our Engage team is Sonia Harb, Fatima Saman, Aisha Ghazi Edwin, and we have our intern Parker. Yeah, well, anyways, sorry about that. But you can see here on our slide where our website is, and you can see all of our past sessions as well as in a few days the recording for today. And with that, I will pass it on to Aisha, and she will moderate this session.
Thank you, Trina. Hi, everyone. My name is Aisha Ghazi Edwin. I use a pronoun she and hers, and I have short black hair. I'm wearing a black blazer, and I'm really excited to be here today. This is, as Dr. Shanks described, a really special session that's going to be focused on how our multimodal infrastructure of our cities is connected to equity and why social workers should care. We have some really amazing researchers and advocates that work in this space today, and I want to give them a chance to introduce themselves. Just after a quick reminder that please do, students of the Engage community class, please stay on for 30 minutes after the session. Okay, so our amazing speakers, I want to give you each about 5 to 7 minutes to introduce yourselves. The prompts are on the next slide. So name, pronoun, identifiers, and your organizations or work in this space. So I'm going to go in order. Donnell, why don't you kick us off?
Hi, everyone. I'm Donnell Wyche. I serve full-time as the senior pastor of the Vineyard Church of Ann Arbor. I use the pronouns he, him, and his. I am an African-American male with short black hair wearing what I might describe as a fuchsia colored shirt. I also serve in the city of Ann Arbor as a community organizer. So I've worked in the area around abolition and helping to create the first unarmed public safety program in the city of Ann Arbor with a group of organizers called the Coalition Reimagining Our Safety. I serve also as a planning commissioner and an advocate for affordable housing in Ann Arbor. And I am an avid biker, so I try to bike somewhere between 10 and about 20 to 25 miles a week. So that's me.
Awesome. Thank you. Welcome. Molly, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Molly Kleinman. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman wearing red framed glasses with long dark hair. And I have a bunch of different things that I do. I feel like I'll start with the things that are most relevant to today's conversation. So I'm the former chair of the Ann Arbor Transportation Commission, and I still serve as a commissioner. I've been on the commission since 2018. I was a founding member of Common Cycle, which is an Ann Arbor nonprofit that helps people learn how to maintain and take care of and fix their bikes, and is really committed to all kinds of people and all kinds of bikes. I'm also the co-host of the Ann Arbor AF podcast, which covers Ann Arbor politics and local issues, especially around housing, transportation, and community safety. I serve as an elected trustee of the Ann Arbor District Library. The library might not seem like it has much to do with transportation, but we have trucks that move around the city all day, every day. And I think there are resources that we make available and things there that might be relevant. I'm also an advocate and organizer, including with Donnell, with the Coalition for Re-envisioning Our Safety. And then professionally, in my day job, I'm the managing director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy program at the Ford School of Public Policy. And there are ways that my work in thinking about innovation and technology policy touches on transportation. And I am very happy to geek out with anyone who wants to about the role of innovation and technology in transportation equity, if there are people interested in that, or if we want to save that for the later discussion. And also for the social work students, STPP does have a graduate program that's open to a graduate certificate that's open to all graduate students at the University of Michigan. And so for folks who are interested in these intersections of especially technology and equity and social policy, come talk to me more after, later. Not today, we're focusing on transportation.
All related. Thank you, Molly. Idrees, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. Idrees Mutahr. My pronouns are he, him. I'm an Arab American man. I'm wearing a blue shirt. And I currently work as a project manager with the Joe Louis Greenway at the city of Detroit. Prior to this role, I was actively involved in transit advocacy and bus rider advocacy, to be specific, with the grassroots organization Motor City Freedom Riders. I've also been involved in other organizations. Bike Dearborn is a bicycle advocacy organization in Dearborn. And then I've also done a number of different things. I've been living, experiencing transportation, writing about transportation for the better part of the last 10 years. So something I care about deeply, and have had different roles in influencing it over the last several years. But I'm really excited to be working at the city now on this project as a project manager. But we'll get to talk about all those things in more detail later, I'm sure. So I'll pass it on to the next person.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Ruth, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you. My name is Ruth Johnson, and I'm a brown-skinned African-American woman. I'm wearing braids a little bit past my shoulders, and I think I'm really wearing the fuchsia outfit. Donnell, you can call it fuchsia, but mine's a deep, hot pink, one of my favorite colors. I serve as the Public Policy Director for CDAD, Community Advocates of Detroit, Community Development Advocates of Detroit, again, affectionately called CDAD, and we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, member-oriented organization that's, we have about 200 members who are focused on Detroit neighborhoods, Detroiters, and the quality of life in Detroit. Before that, I had 10 years of full-time experience as a public transit and mobility advocate, but I consider myself eternal, compassionate, passionate housing and transportation justice advocate.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Do you want to share a little bit of your slides now, or?
Yes, I could do that. Do I
That'd be
have
great.
a need to be Would you mind if I use my slides? Because I've made a couple changes. Can I get share screen
Sure.
privileges?
Sure, yeah.
Sorry about that. I should have warned you.
No, that's okay. I'm gonna make,
Minor changes, but important changes.
yeah, no
Okay.
problem.
Okay, let me bring it up. Okay. Let me start. How do I do this? I don't want to. How do
You
I
want to go
do
to
this?
play?
Start. Someone can help me figure out how to do just the slide and not the side part.
I think,
Slideshow.
hold on.
Use a slideshow from the beginning.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
should know this by now. Really, we all should know this by now.
We get it, we get
Thank
it.
you for your patience again. I just wanted to show you a few slides just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, but I know we'll have a lot of great discussion and comments by everybody. I already introduced CDAD. We're advocating for public policies and resources that advance the work of nonprofit community-based organizations and resident-led groups in Detroit neighborhoods. This year, 2023, we're celebrating 25 years serving as the leading voice of Detroit's community development sector. And you can see my email address if you want to follow up with me afterwards. I know there are many definitions and understandings of racial equity, but again, I'll give you the definition that I want to share with you today. It is the process of eliminating racial disparities and improving things for all of us. So it's not just with certain groups, but these outcomes are for all of us. And it's intentional and continual practice of changing policy programs, systems, and structures by prioritizing measurable changes in people's lives. I know we're going to talk a little bit about infrastructure, but my focus is always on people and their lives. And a lot of work and training I do around racial equity, I ask question, who benefits, who is burdened, and who decides? That's a quick, I know that's not a full analysis, but sometimes it's helpful just to ask yourself and ask if you're working in a group for the group to answer those questions. I want to talk about different types of equity, because a lot of times I've heard people say, I'm not a racist. I am not doing anything that's racist. You know what? We all are living in this society filled with structural, institutional, individual, and interpersonal inequities, discrimination, and racism. But there's also horizontal equity and vertical equity. In the context of transportation equity, we can look at, well, everybody can ride the bus. Everybody can use bike lanes. But if you look at those who are most impacted, or those who may have disabilities, or may be in different social economic things, or for instance, even if there's an electronic wallet or a lot of digital tools to access public transit modes and options, but if you don't have internet, or you may not even have a phone, or have limited minutes on your phone, or may not have the visual or cognitive ability to use some of these apps, then that's not equity. And part about racial equity is using our collective power, not as individuals, to eliminate these disparities and discrimination and to improve outcome. And I can talk a little bit, but I don't want to go too deep because I can go really deep about power over, power with, power to, and power within. When I do trainings, I always talk about we are born with power. So we don't need to be empowered. People don't need to give us power. We have it innately, but we need to learn how to use it effectively to have the outcomes we want. So power over is what most people think. It's using force, whether physical force or governmental force, to make people do things. Then there's power with. When you work with other people in your community, and governmental or public officials, who have the power to really change these policies, programs, systems, and structures. But we also have the power to do that through citizen initiatives, ballot initiatives, and then power too. What is it that you want to do? But I think one of the most important things to recognize, we all have power within. We have the power to change our words, our actions, our attitudes, so that we can be better at understanding and implementing racial equity practices and policies. And I'm just going to touch on this briefly again. There are different types of collective power. With all the strikes that you've probably been hearing about, we know about labor and collective power there. Community power, whether it's a block club or just a group of people who get around, organize around an issue. There's economic, there are economic boycotts and things like that. Most people are familiar with the political. That's voting. For those of you who may have had something on your ballot earlier this week, and we've got lots of things coming next year. But it's also just our collective power every day of the year, not just on election day, to, again, work with and advocate for the things we want and for the things we don't want. Okay. These are just some principles I'd ask, and Aisha, let me know if I need to go faster or anything. Focusing on people, again, rather than a MOS, the built environment or infrastructure. Focus on systemic change and racial justice. It's not about an app or technology, best practices, placemaking, or even individual choice. Although we do have individual choices and power, I would say when we talk about justice, it's not just about what individuals do. I place greater value on community and resident power, assets, experience, and expertise. Many times, in this space, we hear about people talking about experts, and then they talk about people with lived experience. I believe people with lived experience is all of us, if we're alive, but also lived experience is experience. We don't need to classify and differentiate by different types of experience and expertise. But also, we cannot continue to work with current decision-making models, but we need to create new models centered on community and resident participation and power. I will wait, but there are some examples I will probably cite in our discussion. I don't know how much time we have, but most of my work is in Detroit or Metro Detroit, so these are examples. And here are some resources that I hope can be shared later.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I really appreciate you kind of like level setting the conversation and grounding it in racial equity. And also, your discussion about approaching this issue from kind of an asset-based, strength-based perspective, I think is so relevant to social workers, because frequently I think that we are taught and we believe that social workers are the one that advocate for everyone else. And in part, we do. But really, our main job is to help people advocate for themselves and realize their own power, right? And individualism, and approaching problems and individuals with an asset-based, kind of strength-based approach. Instead of what's missing here, it's what do they already have? What are the tools? What are the unique strength and knowledge this individual has because of the community in which they existed or their lived experience? So thank you for highlighting all of that. For some more kind of level setting, you may have all noticed that this panel has speakers from focusing in Detroit to Ann Arbor. And I did that purposefully because I think the two cities, when it comes to transportation, equity, advocacy, infrastructure, equity, and advocacy, are doing similar but also very different things. And they have very different demographics. Their populations are very different. And their history and how the city's infrastructure was built is also very different. And I think that's important to acknowledge when we talk about why our cities are built the way they are today, right? Also, quick level setting. I'm also I work as the deputy director of a disability rights nonprofit in Detroit, and we have the privilege of working with CDAD and Ruth frequently. So this conversation's also been informed by that experience. as well as I'm an Ann Arbor City Council member. In this conversation, I'm not speaking in that capacity, but that role has taught me, and I'm still learning, how connected transportation and walkable and bikeable infrastructure is, and how necessary it is for equity in our cities. So my whole spiel. And now I really want to dive kind of deeper into the conversation a little bit. And why don't we just start with asking, the general question to all of you about why is city infrastructure important, and how does it create access and barriers to the way that people move around cities? And anyone, please feel free to jump in.
I'm not sure why my fellow panelists are bashful, but I would just go back to something I said. It's the people that are important, and infrastructures, social structures, political structures, all structure should be in the service of people. So I would flip the question, how do we create structures, whether physical, political, social, that support the lives of people and how they want to live their lives?
Thanks, Ruth.
So I think I'll jump in here. I think that's a very broad question, but I think that there's a lot of consequences to how we build our environment, and I think it determines really a lot about how we move about our day-to-day, both physically, but also just how we interact with the world. Whenever I approach a problem like this, I think about it through like the practical experience of like everyday people and what they're going through. I think that's sort of almost to Ruth's point about focusing on people. And when it comes to transportation, the way that we build our cities really determines how you're able to move around and how you can live your life. And that has all sorts of downstream consequences. Because really what we, especially here in Michigan and Metro Detroit, I think it's true in both Ann Arbor and Detroit to different degrees, but we've created cities over the last 80 years where really the only feasible mode of getting around is with a personal vehicle. And the burdens of that are just incredible. I mean, if you're talking about the cost burdens, even thinking across the board in American society, not just people living in poverty, 25% of household income goes to, automobile ownership in terms of purchasing the vehicle, fueling the vehicle, insuring the vehicle. And then from a government standpoint, thinking about the amount of resources that go into building our roads, building our highways, massive resources that go into that. I think it could, I could go on. I don't want to go through like the full list, but the way that we've built our cities have created all of because we're so focused on one mode and not a diverse, set of options that, meet many different people's needs. A lot of people are falling through the cracks and are not able to get where they need to go, can't afford to get where they need to go, are physically incapable of moving about our city in the way that they really have a right to be able to move around our cities in those ways, just because it's, either they can't drive or, there are physical barriers, there are no sidewalks in certain places because we don't prioritize that. The quality of the infrastructure is not meant for people in wheelchairs or pedestrians or cyclists, or, in the case of cyclists, they're not safe. Many people die on our roads because of the way that we design them. And we only prioritize one mode of transit. I think that's sort of where I would start the conversation. There's so much more we could say. Molly, were you going to jump? Did you have something you wanted to jump in with, or?
No, I think you covered the big pieces. There's like each one of your sentences was like the entry to a rabbit hole where we could spend all
Yeah.
day.
I
But
tried not to go too deep.
right, I'm trying to like we'll get there, but I think that was a great place to start.
I think I just would like to add that there is a lot of intentionality in the way that our cities are designed. I think that intentionality happens to rest with those who held or who hold the power at the time that those conversations are happening. So for instance, in the city of Ann Arbor, it grows from like a 4-page zoning document and street sort of layout into now something that's over 282 pages. And so why go from something small to something really significantly larger? Well, you're trying to communicate as a community effectively who you want to keep out and how you want to control the movement of the people who are in, and how you prioritize the city around the needs of those who are inside versus those who might want to come in or those that you perceive as outsiders. And I think I don't know how much of that conversation happens in these conversations. It's like we built everything, so we can unbuild everything, and even things that are codified in law, right? Because we created the laws to hold things the way that we wanted them at the time. And I think what we're seeing now is a realization, because this conversation we're in today is intersected by our climate crisis, because we've introduced all these cars into our built environment. They are polluting and they are affecting our climate. And now we're realizing, oh, that wasn't a really good idea. So now let's roll some of these things back. But the built infrastructure is a memorial in some sense to how we thought about people and how they should move and who should live where and what access and resources they should have access to. So now we're experiencing all this resistance to effectively changing things for our collective good. And I think that is a part of this conversation that I don't feel like we talk about a lot. I hear why we can't do things a lot more, and how the built environment prevents us. But I feel like that should be a part of our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Donnell just said and Idrees said. And I want to give some concrete examples, all pun intended. As far as sidewalks, it may not be intentional, but when someone leaves an electric scooter or a bike across the sidewalk, that becomes a barrier to someone in a wheelchair who now has to go to the very opposite end of the block, take the crosswalk over, probably have to wait for the traffic signal, the pedestrian signal, and then go on the other side of the street. And so sometimes we think, oh, I would never do that. But I think we all have done things, just temporarily left something and it blocked a curb cut. And Policy Link actually has what they describe as the curb cut effect, that is not just for people with disabilities. It helps us all to have curb cuts. Another example is our freeway system. And two ways that are barriers is that it divided neighborhoods. The best example in Detroit is the I-375, the Chrysler Freeway in downtown Detroit was, and this is the pattern in other metropolitan areas, it decimated Black Bottom and Paradise Valley, predominantly African-American, vibrant business and entertainment districts. And there was just a discussion earlier this week before the Detroit City Council, because there's funds available now to try to address and the harm that was created, but they're creating more harms just by making it, rather than below grade, a 9-lane at grade freeway through still historic and beautiful neighborhoods with some pedestrian crosswalks for safety and a bike lane adjacent. But what about all the businesses, all the families, which also impacts the 1967 rebellion, because many of the families and businesses from Black Bottom and Paradise Valley ended up on 12th Street, now called Rosa Parks Boulevard, which was at the heart, the center of the 67 rebellion. So a lot of things are tied into this, but also as we look at our freeway systems, they're designed to take people from the suburbs to the city primarily. And even our bus system is based upon a spoke system based upon 9-to-5 jobs, even though many of the people who use public transit, they're doing shifts or they're using it for something other than a 9-to-5 job coming to the central business district. But even funding follows these spatial, racial spatial inequity, because both federal, state, and local funding funds more of the capital part. So these is the buses and the terminals, but not for wages for the bus drivers, not to provide paratransit as much as the need to meet the need as our society is aging. And Metro Detroit has a larger percentage of people with reported disabilities than other areas. I don't know about Ann Arbor, but again, good transit, good mobility benefits us all.
Thank you, Ruth. And I want to thank, Donnell, Ruth, for bringing up kind of how history intersects with this. One of the things that I really hope that we can talk about and all gain from this conversation is how really racist past and current policies that shaped where houses are built, how big their lot sizes are, how close buildings are together and homes are together, density, the building of highways through prosperous Black neighborhoods that happened in Detroit, has happened all over the nation. How those laws and how they continue today, we have restrictions currently in most cities around how dense housing can be in a neighborhood. So single family homes, right? Big yards, how all of those decisions were intentional to keep some people out and bring other people in. And they intentionally created cities where resources, like you have food deserts, are not available. And the populations are not available to are predominantly low income, BIPOC populations, Black populations, especially. And then you have city infrastructure where it's really easy to gain access to things. And it should be said that cities in which they have built up transit systems, they have sidewalks that are built well and wide, and they have biking infrastructure, which is protected. They're economically more prosperous, but they're also they're physically more healthy. They're mentally more healthy. And we are at a crux right now because the advocacy has started around, let's build more bike lanes, let's build more sidewalks. And you see a lot of people, I have worked with, in our organization, we have people who are BIPOC who don't understand that the largest number of pedestrian victims are actually people of color and people with disabilities. And their class has gotten wrapped into this. Like bike lanes are something you see in rich white cities like Ann Arbor. But why should we care? Why should we care if, we're minorities? Why is this an equity issue? I know I just covered a lot.
I think I can jump in there. Because really the city of Detroit is actually one of the most dangerous cities in the country for pedestrians. And that trend has only accelerated since the pandemic started, where we're seeing a significant rise in pedestrian fatalities. The vast majority of those, of course, are Black Detroiters. You're in a city that's 80% Black. And so that's just a natural consequence of the way that we've designed our city and designed these roads. And so that's a really big issue. And I think there is sort of a framing sometimes or a mental association with what bike lanes are. But I think really the communities that need these safety amenities are maybe, not who you stereotypically associate with building bike lanes. We do need these sort of amenities in low-income communities where you do see those high proportions of pedestrian fatalities, where you see kids dying, because it just improves their quality of life and improves their safety. It helps kids get to school. You know, what I think was interesting, I believe early on in the early 2000s, sort of before it had really gotten as widespread as it is today, some of the incentives for actually installing a lot of the bike lanes in Detroit were not for cyclists necessarily, but to narrow the streets, to make them safer for, you know, to act as a sort of traffic calming measure, which is another sort of perspective to look at the, you know, the use of these infrastructures in the city. I also wanted to touch on the point that Donnell and Ruth made. Sort of Donnell mentioned, you know, the fact that we built all this infrastructure. So there are things that we can do about them, but sort of the barrier of, you know, the long-term investment that we've made up until this point. And then to Ruth's point about I-375 and Black Bottom, you know, I'm really passionate about history, especially local history. That's one of the major lenses that I use to understand what's happened in our city and sort of why we live in the way that we do. And I think it's really, you know, if you really look back at how we ended up with the city that we live in today, it goes as far back as the 1920s, really, when the automobile industry started to pick up. And we've really doubled, tripled, quadrupled down on that, you know, designing our cities around that since then. One of the things that makes me personally really depressed is the kinds of projects that were executed in the 50s and 60s. So in addition to the freeways being built, the city, with funding from the federal government, specifically targeted neighborhoods that were dense, that were mixed use, that were considered slums, especially. It was a slum clearance program as part of the Housing Act of 1953, I believe. And they just completely demolished neighborhoods across the United States. Wholesale slum clearance. We're talking about, you know, all of Black Bottom that was east of 375. So, you know, there's the actual freeway itself, but then the entire neighborhood to the east, which is really the homes, the businesses, you know, the economic engine of the Black community in Detroit at the time, was totally decimated. And then, but I think while that one has gotten a lot of attention, I think what people also need to understand is that there were several other of those projects that happened all over Detroit's core. You know, there was the Corktown slum clearance. There was another one just east of Lafayette Park, Elmwood Park. There's Forest Park to the north of that, just north of Eastern Market. There's one near Wayne State. You know, Woodbridge experienced slum clearance with the Jeffries project. I can't even, there's the cultural center near, you know, the DIA. So there's like, I think every neighborhood that surrounds the core of Detroit experienced some wholesale where they just went in and cleared the neighborhood out and built apartment buildings and solely residential developments that were sort of big blocks of development, not mixed use. So you can't really walk around. You can't really go shopping in that district. You can't go to work in that district. And so it's an investment that also created the need for more cars. It's sort of this paradox of decreasing intensity of users, you know, the things that are happening in that community, and also thinning people out and sort of making them need to go further away for their daily needs.
That is such.
And I think that's just to sort of wrap up. Sorry, I think that goes back to Donnell's point that it's sort of a long-term investment that we've made in this, and so now we're faced with this challenge of undoing 100 years now of that kind of investment.
And to bring it in for Ann Arbor, it was 1970 when City Council was arguing on lot sizes, to bring up your original question around how do we get to the kind of structures that we have, the lot sizes and configurations and the buildings and the setbacks. And it was 1970, City Council was arguing, like, any lot in the city of Ann Arbor needed to be a minimum of 1 acre. And the argument that was being proposed here was to keep Negroes out of the city of Ann Arbor. I mean, it's in the paper, quoted, direct. That's a direct quote, and I'll put the quote in the chat in just a moment. And when you think about that, so people don't know that the city of Ann Arbor was a segregated city until, Molly, you can give me the correct dates, at late 80s or so.
Yeah, late 80s is when the schools attempted to desegregate under the threat of a federal lawsuit.
Yeah. And people don't think of Ann Arbor. I did not think of Ann Arbor that way. I shouldn't say people, these mysterious people. I did not think of Ann Arbor that way. I had thought, oh, Ann Arbor is one of the most liberal cities in Michigan. It's a great place to raise a family, to be there. And then you get in and you see these intentional decisions that the legislative bodies within the city have made to shape and form a community. So you can look at all our Title I schools. They're all in very specific communities within our city. You can look at housing prices. You can look at the zoning to see how many of our neighborhoods have very large lot zoning. They also don't have sidewalks in their neighborhood. So you walk through the Arbor Hills. These are very large, like 20,000 square foot lot, minimum lot sizes. They don't have sidewalks. And just imagine, in the city of Ann Arbor, there are some 441 miles of sidewalks paved. Even with that, we have a 140-mile gap. And in 10 years, since 2013 till today, we've only built 14 and a half miles of new sidewalks to close the gap. So we have a 140-mile gap. And in 10 years, we've only built 14 and a half miles. And when you talk about this, people will say cars are not going away. They're electrifying. That's going to help the environment, but we still have to have infrastructure for cars. Then you talk about biking infrastructure. Well, we have 90 miles of bike lanes. That's paint. But we only have 1.8 of fully protected bike lanes. Now we're putting in plastic bollards in various places and rapid places to extend that out. But that's a mere 2% of all of the roadways in the city. And so when you start to think about that, you realize like, oh, this is a priority. Someone has decided that this is how this should be. And I think this also goes to our loss of population. A lot of your grad students who are coming here being educated at the #1 social work school in the country, or for public schools. I don't know where your ranking is for the School of Social Work. You are #1. Okay. So they're coming here to get educated, but they're not going to stay here. They're not going to stay here and raise their families. They're not going to stay here and make a life here because the cost of living is so high. They won't be able to afford a place. If they could afford a place, they can't get around because we have like one area of our city that is completely walkable, like the Carytown area of our city, where if you were fortunate to have like $2 million to buy a house in that neighborhood, you would be in your 15-minute neighborhood. But you can't replicate that neighborhood in our city today. Our zoning prohibits it. And just so people have context, Carytown was the historical African-American neighborhood and district in Ann Arbor. It had the segregated school that is now community high there, right? So there's a lot that we do intentionally to build this out. And I think the biggest thing that I've learned in my advocacy is there is somebody who is sitting at a legislative table who has the decision-making ability, who is making this decision. And as social workers, one of the things I just wanted to come and ask you all to do is to show up at these meetings advocating for the people that you serve. And I think it's like just this week, I had to move a bunch of my kids around to get them to doctor's appointments and so forth. And we are fortunate that we have 2 cars, because without having that transportation, if my kids are sick, how do I even move them around our city to get them to their doctor's appointment, to get them the medicine that they need to have picked up, or to be able to care for them at home without having to drive, right? Like there's all these things that we've built in that we haven't considered, and it requires somebody who is thinking about all of these systems collectively, talking to the legislative table to say, we know, let me put it this way. I won't be as nice. We have a dashboard in our city on the condition of each of our roads. You can go to a website, put in a road, and it will tell you the condition of that road. That was a decision. Somebody said, it is important enough to the constituency that I represent that I will direct resources and infrastructure to tell people how well this road drives. Now go ahead, Molly.
So I want to build on what you're saying, Donnell, because I feel like now is the moment to sort of bring in what I think some people would describe as a radical or extreme perspective, but cars are vampires. And there are lots of different ways that you can think about cars as being things that suck up resources from individuals. So the average cost of owning a car in the US is $12,000 a year. So if you've built an environment where a car is a requirement to access food, school, work, baseline, this is what you're demanding of people. And that's a huge burden on a huge number of families across the country. On a citywide level, in Ann Arbor, roads and parking are 1/3 of our downtown land area. And there are other cities in Ann Arbor where it's even higher. If you look at downtown Lansing, it's just like parking lots as far as the eye can see. And all of that square footage that you're devoting to housing for cars can't be housing for people, can't be schools, it can't be other kinds of, like can't be businesses. And then in terms of city spending, if you are investing in, as Donnell said, we have this dashboard, which then incentivizes us to focus really heavily on road quality and to spend on road quality. The state of Michigan has dramatically expanded its total number of road miles, even as our state population has stayed flat over the last 30 years. And every new lane mile that we build has a future cost in maintenance. And at this point, we will never ever catch up. This idea that we can somehow fix the damn roads, it's a pyramid scheme. It's impossible. We've built more than we can manage, and we keep throwing more money at it. And all of this comes down to the resource demands of cars. And I think that has a lot of implications for equity. I'm not even talking about safety, which is another, we were starting to get there, that the impacts of car crashes are not evenly distributed. Poor people, people of color, disabled people, the elderly and children are much more likely to be killed or injured in car crashes. And white people are more likely to be the ones driving those cars. And so there's all of these different ways in which what it comes down to is cars, but it is so difficult to have that conversation, especially in Michigan, because when you challenge this notion that cars are a necessity and that cars are something we should build around, people feel really threatened because their car is their freedom. Well, why is their car their freedom? Because we have trapped them in a place where they need that car to access anything. So it's my little radical rant.
Add a little more nuance and a different perspective. As far as cars, I don't see them as either good or bad. It's how we use them. and how do we make decisions and investments? So before there was Uber and Lyft, there's always been shared rides, carpools to school. In Detroit, we have older Black men, primarily retirees, and they hang outside of laundromats and grocery stores, and they give rides to moms with a couple kids and maybe 6 bags of grocery, and you know that's 36 mega roll of toilet paper that's really hard to get on the bus. And so that's still using a car, but using it differently. For people with disabilities, then they may not be able to use an electric scooter, a bike, or even access fixed route. So their van services run both by public and private entities, sometimes with public funding. So I think we have to think about how we use cars, how they're funded. I do understand about greenhouse gases and the roads, but we also use roads for buses, for shared rides. So roads aren't the problem, and cars aren't the problem. It's how we use them and how we fund them. And going back to what Darnell said about the intersection about housing and transportation and discrimination, I would say that we need to look at the past, do what we can in the present, and plan for the future, because they're all tied together. In Detroit, there's called the Burwood Wall, BIRWOOD Wall, WALL. There's a Wikipedia on it, and it's actually a wall that was used for redlining, and the whites were living on one side and the blacks on the other side. And yeah, there's a mural on it, and it's in a park, but there's a historical marker, and you can even see now, if you look over either side of the wall, the evidence, ongoing evidence of the disinvestment in one neighbor, an investment, whether it's public money or private money. And I would have you think about, every time there's a decision to invest in something, that is also a decision not to invest. And my last point is, rather than as social work students and soon to be social work professionals, or just even in your personal lives, rather than speaking for people, I'd like for you to adopt a mindset. What can I do to help people speak for themselves and use their own power? One of the ways, when I was working for a transportation justice nonprofit organization, we had the Faces of Transit project. We, employees, volunteers, board members, students from lots of colleges and universities would just interview people using our phones, and they would say what they wanted. Because sometimes dealing with transportation, childcare, job schedules, school schedules, they can't come to these public meetings that many times are in the smack dab middle of the day at a location that's not convenient. But we brought it and just played it for them. Or we'd have public comment parties where people would write out their comments. You know, we'd get food, we have some nice music, and, you know, make it fun, provide some childcare, make it very clear that you can bring your kids to the public comment party, because we're going to have children's games, and we might have several language translators. We may have American Sign Language. So there are many ways. But even if you're organizing a group of clients or other people in your community to go to a public meeting, think about providing a van service, a pickup service, or Uber passes, or parking. Provide childcare in the building. And I don't want to make it sound as licensed childcare. We'll call it child activities. Usually, so the parent is still in the room. You don't have to, worry about the regulations around licensed childcare. Do what you need to do to support people speaking for themselves, because I don't think there's anything more powerful than people saying what they need. They may not have all the stats, they may not have all the history, but I firmly believe people are experts in what they need, their families need, and their neighborhoods need.
Yeah, I'll add to that. And I think that sort of community engagement piece and really being sensitive to the different users for different types of transportation is really important. I think I'll give two sort of very different examples from my work in the past and the work I do now. With Motor City Freedom Riders, especially during the pandemic, one of the things we would do to connect with bus riders, which is sometimes a challenging group to organize. People have places to go, you're catching people in transit. What we would do is we put up a sign at bus stops. And this was also during the pandemic. So thinking about how to connect with people virtually when it wasn't possible to do so in person. So we put up banners around the region with a QR code that they could scan and a phone number that they could text. And we were able to communicate with bus riders that way. And we heard about some of the challenges they were facing with buses not showing up, especially with a massive rider shortage at the time, and difficulty with the agency not being able to find drivers. A lot of buses just were not showing up. And that was one of the complaints we heard. And we were able to sort of understand the severity of that issue by connecting directly with people waiting at bus stops. Another thing is we would go to some of the busier bus stops, like at KMAC, and we would go and interview bus riders just on our phones, go have a conversation, ask them about what routes they take, and what are some of the challenges they've been facing. And we'd hear things about people not being able to make night shifts, some of the night buses not working or not running on time, similar issues to what we heard from the signs. But connecting with people, like Ruth said, where they are. In my work now as a project manager for the Joe Louis Greenway, we're doing engagement in different areas and in different phases, depending on where that segment of the Greenway is in development now. But where we're working on the design, for example, we might want to connect with the community and block clubs and residents and stakeholders in an area to understand, what do you want out of the Greenway in this neighborhood? What should it look like? What's the design that makes most sense to you? Where should it go? What's the path that it takes in your neighborhood? And rather than having a meeting where we say, okay, I'm having a big public meeting in this building at this time. I hope all of you show up. I'm going to flyer the neighborhood. What I start that process off with doing first is really getting to know people. Going to their block club meetings. I was in people's living rooms. I go to their parks. I go to their, their meet and greets, community events. I might give a 5-minute sort of, this is what the Joe Louis Greenway is if you haven't heard of it. If you have, great, this is what we're planning. This is what's coming up. Do you guys have any initial thoughts? Getting a feel for what's in the community first, and then maybe 2-3 months down the road, when I have those relationships established, actually talking about, bringing everyone together into a room and saying, is this what we want out of the Greenway? So that's sort of 2 different ways of meeting people where they are in that work.
Thanks for raising that. And I do want to, it's interesting. There's this ideological, I think, difference that was just mentioned about the way we think of cars. And I think that, there's definitely a place for nuance. But one thing that I have learned, because I've also had to confront my own thinking about feeling that cars are a necessity. And it's this circular kind of logic. Like I had to question myself, and I still try to, how much of that belief of mine is because I live in a city and always have lived in a city that is set up to be for cars. You know what I mean? Like when I lived in New York, I walked everywhere. That was the neighborhood that I lived in was set up to walk everywhere. So I think there is some nuance, and there's definitely populations that, cannot bike or may choose to take a car. And I think that's fine. But I think what's important is that we build cities so that everywhere you go, you can safely and comfortably move around in all these different types of ways, whether if you want to walk or if you want to bike or if you want to drive a car, right? One mode of mobility shouldn't take precedent over another. And I think what Molly and a few of you have said is that unfortunately cars are given the most priority, even in the way we assess how well our roads are, there's so much emphasis on road evaluation. I also want to go ahead, Idrees.
Oh, I was just gonna add to that, when it comes to this question of, our dependency on cars and people, I think I trust a lot of people's intuitive sense of what makes sense for them and what's feasible for them to get around a region. So personally, looking at the historical record, yeah, I see that cars are a problem. But when someone tells me I can't get around without a car, I think that it's, when you talk to that person, it's easy to understand why. And so 100%. I'm a big believer in leading with more of the carrot than the stick. You know, not trying to disincentivize driving necessarily. Maybe in specific circumstances there are reasons to do that, but more so thinking about how do we make these alternatives feasible, or invest in them at all if they don't exist yet. You know, creating new alternatives, new ways for people to get around, and making that experience easier so that people are choosing not to drive in the car, or they have access now to a service that they needed that wasn't available before as an alternative. So I don't think it's, I don't think it's good to, you know, think about it as just like a, you know, something that we need to penalize, that we're trying to, you know, force people not to drive cars. I think that some people sort of have that reactionary impulse that, oh, you don't want us to drive cars anymore. For me personally, it's more about how do I make it easier for you to use these other modes? And I think people will naturally take to those as a preference.
I think one issue is that because we've given so much space to cars in our cities, anytime we try to give more space to everyone else, transit, pedestrians, bicyclists, drivers experience that as something being taken away. And sometimes it is. And that may or may not actually mean that they like that it takes them longer to get places. Sometimes lane reductions, when you actually measure throughput, it doesn't change. It just feels longer because it's, you know, you're backed up farther from the traffic light or whatever it is. But it sets up these battles over who gets the space that we've dedicated to transportation. And I intentionally come in with a perhaps more extreme argument than a lot of folks who actually have to do the work day to day, where you actually have to, you know, be interacting with drivers. But there are some key pieces that I think are often surprising to people. So I frequently see in community arguments about the need to be able to drive everywhere, that it's about accessibility for people with disabilities. But 40% of people with disabilities can't or don't drive in the United States. And for many of those people, in order to live independently, that means they have to be able to get around without a car, not relying on rides, whether that's from paratransit or from family members and friends. And if we build a system where you can walk safely, you can bike safely, plenty of people with disabilities can bike, that is independence and freedom for people. I think often the sort of mental image that people have about a disabled person is someone with a mobility disability, like using a wheelchair. But there are so many different kinds of disabilities and so many different kinds of transportation needs. And that's one of the reasons why I want there to be many different kinds of options, which is going to mean we have to take space from cars, because right now they have almost all of it. And that's a tough thing for a lot of people to accept when they are so accustomed to everything being built around their preferred mode.
And I just want to echo that, because we're seeing a shift where retailers and our commercial spaces are responding to the built environment. So if you have been paying attention at all to the latest trends amongst fast casual or fast food restaurants, they're changing up all of their structures. So Taco Bell is getting rid of interior seating so that they can have more drive-through lanes. Chick-fil-A is building 2-story facilities so they can service 75 cars at a time. You're seeing Panera close down well-established facilities so that they can move into a space that has a drive-through. So then what we wind up doing is it's just this cycle, and we force it. So you can't walk up to a drive-through. It's not allowed. You can't even bike up to a drive-through. It's not allowed. And so then what you're saying is, in order to access this service, you have to have this specific mode of transportation. And I just, for a moment, want to tell my origin story. I grew up in DC. Our family did not own a car. My mom is 68. She still does not own a car. I walked to my elementary school. I walked 25 minutes to my middle school. I took a bus and a subway to my high school. I went to college without a car. I got to college and all my roommates, they had cars. I was like, who are these people? Like, this car is going to sit here for like 20 hours of the day just in this parking lot. And they had late model, brand new cars. I was like, this is a whole different life. And this was in, rural Ohio where I went to college. And it wasn't until I graduated from college, took my first job with IBM, which located me in Michigan, did I get a driver's license, because I didn't have a driver's license because I didn't need one because I had a bike and I could go anywhere I needed to on a bike or I could walk. And then I got my first car when I got here to Michigan. So like I'm in the car brain space because like I live here, but I'd much rather walk. I can access my neighbors, my community, the built environment better if I'm walking or if I'm biking. There are benefits to that for my mental health. There are benefits for that for my physical health, for me to be in a walkable environment where I can just not be so stressed out in a car. And I think those are decisions, right? Like DC has a metro system, it has a bus system, and of course, it has roadways which are accessible to cars, but it gives people the choice. And I think in this environment, we've taken a lot of that choice away. And now we're trying to change that. And that's the resistance that we're encountering, which is a new imaginative space. How do we enter into a new imaginative space that says we don't have to just do things the way that they've been done? We can imagine a new way forward. But that takes leadership and it takes money, because we have to really undo the built environment, which is a sticking point for me.
I want to add really briefly, Donnell, you're telling your story reminds me that there's one big population that will never be able to drive, and that's kids. And when you're dealing with the needs of families, the needs of parents, living in a place where kids can get themselves from place to place safely by themselves is a game changer for so many quality of life things, for things like childcare, things like being able to work. I personally experienced when I had to get trying to get my kids to school last year. They were in two different buildings and there was not a lot of options. And there's this busy road between us and the school that they cannot cross themselves. It was a huge chunk of my day, every day, just getting my kids to and from school. And if they could have gotten themselves there and back themselves, that would have made a huge difference for me. And so it's another one of those sort of hidden things around the impact of transportation, especially on families and parents and single parents. Kids are never going to be able to drive themselves.
Yeah, I would like to just chime in kind of quickly. I love this part of the conversation because I think it's really important. And just through some anecdotal experiences, it's been such an interesting way to think about this problem and challenge. I think back to when I went to, when I was younger, I was maybe 13 years old. I went to Yemen with my family to visit family. And obviously in Yemen, not everyone owns a car, and people live in communities where they can walk places. But especially young children have a lot of independence. They're going about their day, just like anyone else would. They can go to the store, they can walk around the village, they can do what they want. And I remember thinking, feeling kind of like the kids then would make fun of us American kids for not being able to, they would say, oh, is it true that you guys stay at home all day? You guys are not allowed to go anywhere. And that's kind of a funny thing that they would just like poke fun at us with. And to an extent, it is true that a lot of American kids, without the supervision of an adult, have no autonomy. And I think that, just kind of having, again, anecdotal, observing the kids that I know from overseas, some of the ones that have moved here, or American kids, they carry themselves overseas a little bit more independently. They're able to navigate the world on their own, in a way that's you know, I think a little bit impressive to see as an American, something we're not used to. And then one more sort of comparison to another society that works differently than ours is when I was in Paris. Seeing the school pick up and drop off was really just a line of parents leaning against the fence and sort of waiting for their kids outside of the school. You know, they walked there, they took the train there. Whereas with us, it becomes this whole ordeal of you know, especially for me growing up, my mom didn't have a license for a long time. So school logistics was always very challenging in getting to and from school. So seeing that, it seems silly and sort of simple. I'm sure if you grew up in another city, you know, New York, DC, it's probably more common there. But as a Detroiter, I think, as someone who grew up in Michigan, seeing that in Paris was an interesting experience. Ruth, I think I saw you unmuted. Did you want to chime in too?
Yes, I appreciate everyone sharing their stories and their experiences in other cities, but let's go back to racial justice being a structural, systemic, institutional equity issue. So as I said, I don't look at individual choices beyond what I'm fighting for is that more people have more options to go more places more easily. And I don't feel I'm in a position to say it's better for this group of people or individuals that it's better to do this. But I do agree, decisions we have made, both investment, structural, you know, infrastructure, does color how people see their choices and how they can exercise their choices. But if someone feels safer, if they're getting off of work at 2 a.m., it doesn't have to be single occupancy vehicle, but waiting at a bus stop, I have to tell you, when I was riding the bus, I did not take the bus after dark, meaning it did curtail my life. But also we have to deal with the current reality. In Detroit, DDOT, which is our public transit primary public transit provider, is only at 63% on-time performance, meaning you might have to wait 2 or 3 buses until a bus comes. And then you also got to think about your transfer. So what are we asking of people and families? How much time to invest or money to invest? And if because of investments and decisions we've made about employment opportunities, educational opportunities, shopping, healthcare, it gets further and further out. We got 23-mile mode, 28-mile road. I don't care whether it's motor vehicles, public transit. At a certain point, it's not sustainable, whether to maintain the roads or trying to maintain public transit. But I don't know how we undo it. At a certain point, we've got to deal with the present reality and do the best we can with what our cities look like, but at the same time, valuing what people think is best for themselves and their families. And I would just say that, full disclosure, I used to work for GM, love cars, but I also grew up, as many of you have said, taking public transit. But again, let us look at the systems, in the decisions, in the investments, so that we can improve from where we are, but also looking at the past in a positive light. The city of Detroit had the largest municipally owned and operated public transit system in the country, and it's still one of the few that is public rather than a private entity. So I think we can learn from the past, what to do, what not to do, and also improve the future by the decisions we make now.
Thanks, Ruth. You know, I want to jump in for a second because I think this conversation about investment in public transit infrastructure is a really important one. I mean, one thing that you said is Detroit has one of the largest, public transit systems. I think it's also important to think about how the big three, we distribute and create, the largest number of cars in Detroit than anywhere else. We also have a landmass that's bigger than Manhattan. It's bigger than cities that have populations that are larger than ours, like Boston, I believe San Francisco, and we don't have a subway system. And how much of that, and we know a large part of it was influenced by us wanting to be this automotive capital, right? And how that then affected investment in things like transit and creating other type of ways that people could move around. But I also agree with you, Ruth, about what you said about there's all different factors that contribute to like ridership, why people may choose to take the bus or not. And people often look at, European countries like Denmark and the Netherlands or Sweden as these examples of like bike utopias. And I talk about, in a country like ours, where we incarcerate the most people in the world, we don't have healthcare. We have, extreme discrepancies between the rich and the poor. We don't pay for education. We make it hard in every other way for people to, like, for me, to jump on my bike and ride my kids to school. A single parent, for example, who's working multiple jobs, how do they find time to do that? So I think that other social welfare programs in a country also determine people's options about how they move, right?
I think one of the really critical issues Ruth touched on, and it's that we've built this region in Metro Detroit, and it's not unique, in every basically metropolitan region in America, that is just so sprawled out. I don't think it's even comparable to anything you'd see in Europe. When I took a train outside of Paris, within 10 miles of Paris, you're in farmland. When you leave Detroit and you're 10 miles out, you're in Dearborn, and you're not very far. And that's probably a third of the way out of the, to the furthest excerpt, out to Canton, where it starts to look like farmland, is maybe 30 miles. So we've created these regions that are uniquely car dependent. And I think it's the really big challenge is starting to think about how we can crack that chicken and egg problem of car dependency and like walkable communities and dense communities. Because it's like, well, can you build the dense community without the transportation services that make that possible? But then can you invest in those really expensive transportation services like subways if it's a really sparsely populated community with a tax base that maybe doesn't necessarily support that? So we have this chicken and egg problem. And I think that looking for solutions that sort of work on both ends in small ways, but in a systemic way, I think is the only way we're really gonna slowly transition out of that. And for me, what that means is, I think we need to start looking at our residential communities and thinking about, sort of to that question I brought up about urban renewal. We built these residential communities in place of these what the government considered slums at the time, but were really mixed use walkable communities. We need to start thinking about how do we actually bring corner stores back. The idea of a corner store is a familiar concept. It's something that you can walk to. It becomes a local resource. And so how do you build in communities now that are totally unwalkable, totally sprawly and sparse, and start to bring back new uses? So not necessarily changing the density inherently, but changing the way that that community is used, so that, hey, maybe I can get a haircut within walking distance. Maybe I can go get some fruits and vegetables down the street. And so changing the inherent layout of the neighborhood, or sorry, the uses of the neighborhood, and the land. But then also on the other end of that, in terms of the transportation services, thinking about our basic services that are offered and just bringing us up to a baseline of good quality bus service that people can access. I say bus service because it's one of the more affordable means of transportation in terms of providing that service. That's a big conversation in Detroit, where some people think that, we shouldn't really invest in anything until it's rail or something that's exciting. But we really need modes of transportation that serve the current users, and where we can, invest in the system as a whole system. Because I think, Ruth mentioned that a lot of the buses right now are only running at 60% capacity. But what is that 60% of? That's 60% of maybe a bus that runs once an hour. once every 30 minutes at best in most of Detroit. And so while we have this big bus system that is a legacy of that really good streetcar system that used to exist, historically, those used to run every 5 minutes, every 3 minutes. Some of them, like on Woodward, probably every, there would be one every couple minutes. You walk up to the street and one shows up. Now, if you're on Woodward, that's the best route in the region. It's once probably every 10, 15 minutes. If you're on other routes, it's hourly. Sometimes it doesn't run past 8 p.m. So just bringing us back to some level, some standard of service that is reliable and actually lets you function, I think is the first step from that other side. So it's both development and it's transportation services that we need to invest in. Is that?
Ruth,
go ahead.
I just wanted to give Ruth, thank you for saying that, Idrees. I also saw that Ruth put some comments in the chat about some comments I made that I think that you also wanted to speak to, Ruth, and I wanted to give you a chance.
I put several comments. Is there one particular you want me to reflect on?
I just didn't want to miss them. I think that you were talking here about walkable neighborhoods, the automotive industry.
Oh, okay, sure. Let me just talk about walkable neighborhoods. I don't use that phrase because people walk in neighborhoods that are not considered walkable. People bike in areas that aren't considered bikeable. I have mixed feelings about bike lanes, whether protected or not. In Detroit, like on Cass Avenue, which is by Wayne State's University's campus, we have protected bike lanes, park lane, travel lanes. And what ends up happening, because it's a very several DDOT, Detroit Department of Transportation, fixed bus routes travel on Cass. So when someone gets on or off the bus, they've got to try to navigate the bike lane, which for many people, that's, oh, just look both ways, make sure. But for some people, that's not easy. And it makes them fearful. So then they don't ride the bus. So their lives are curtailed. Or even if you're in a car, I know if I'm parking in the park lane, I need to look behind so I don't smack a bike, an e-bike, an e-scooter. But also people with disabilities are using it with some of their electric mobility, powered mobility devices. So I get real nervous because I'm like, but then the third thing you have to think about, when you can no longer access the curb, and I think Molly talked about the battle for the curb access and the sidewalk access is real. If you can no longer access the curb, if you're trying to transfer from the car seat to a wheelchair, you got to go down and then up. And now you've made it maybe more difficult or impossible for someone in a wheelchair to transfer from the passenger side into a chair, or you're asking them to be on the travel lane side, and someone brings their chair and then they're transferring in the travel lane. We've really got to think about I do support multimodal design and things, but we also have to think about what does that mean for those who have fewer options, at least currently, or impacts them more. So it's great to have bistro tables and reserve things for food pickup. But if you're doing that, that makes it harder for someone to be dropped off in front of a restaurant who wants to go inside and have a nice meal like anyone else. And I do appreciate there are many types of abilities, but even with MOGO is our bike service. And yes, we've got a lot of stations where the bikes are parked throughout the city, but our city council made sure they were in the neighborhoods. But if you're looking for a bike with physical accessibility, you got to reserve it 5 days in advance. So that, again, there's a disparity of access to publicly supported bike structures and things like that if you have to reserve it in advance, because then you can't just say, hey, let's go over here in the way that other people can. But I also know, and I have friends who use 3-wheel bikes, 5-wheel bikes, all kinds of bikes, but some of the bike lanes don't accommodate some of those bikes. So this is a complex problem, but this is not a problem we cannot solve.
Yeah, I think I'll comment on a few of those points, but I think your last point, I think, is really what I would like to emphasize is that these are complex things, but it's important that we're sort of starting to think about them and talk about them. I work at the city now. I wasn't involved with the CAS bike lanes, but I think, and something that we can say about projects like that is that, you have a very long precedent for building roads for cars, and a lot of engineering experience and sort of familiarity with what works and what doesn't, and standards that work to that effect. I think that the best design of bike lanes is something that we're still, I think, as a society, still learning and still sort of developing. I think there's a lot of improvements to how we build our bike lanes. And I think that that's something that we're going to continue to experiment with, look at new designs and learn lessons as those projects are executed. So, maybe there are some good lessons learned from CAS. So when we go to do another bike lane in another part of the city, we can implement those lessons, and have better infrastructure. Because really, we've only been building bike lanes in Detroit for maybe 10 years now. I don't know when the first one would have been built, but as opposed to other types of infrastructure, we have tons and tons of decades. We have decades and decades of experience. I think I'm trying to remember what your second, with MOGO, I just wanted to point out that they do have sort of a unique program. I think that is something worth applauding them for, is their $5 access pass. So if you do qualify for any sort of state benefits, you can just sign up on their website using that information. And for an annual pass for MOGO, you can access it for $5 a year, which is really important. And I think that they did a great job of rolling that out, and making that service accessible to low-income Detroiters.
Can I just jump in on that point? Because for our wedding anniversary, probably like our 19th wedding anniversary or something like that, my wife and I went to the city of Detroit and spent the day there, just hanging out and on the waterfront. You all have done a really great job of revitalizing that waterfront area. And we saw that they had just released e-bikes in that biking network, the MOGO biking network. And that was the catalyst, because I was an acoustic biker before that. But that experience in Detroit, renting that e-bike, was the catalyst to me getting an e-bike, which I've put 8,000 miles on since I got it in 2019 till now. And then my wife, who was like, no, I don't want to power assist. The bike's going to like do things I don't want it to do. And so she tried mine, and then she test drove her own. And now she has an e-bike, and we have biked the metro parks. We started down river and went all the way to Lake Erie and buy it back on our e-bikes. We did that for another anniversary, had a picnic while we were there. So like, I just want to give props to that network in Detroit, because that was a catalyst for me to say like, oh, this is really fun. It increases my ability to access my community and my city. And they made it so easy. And I was really impressed with that. The thing that you just talked about, which was that if you were a benefit of any kind of state benefit, that you could get it for $5 a day or a discount for the month. And I just thought, oh, that's great. And someone in the chat, Sonia, I think, asked a question what our policy agenda was. And I gave her a big long list in the chat, but I actually wanted to revise that and just say, I think I want the same amount of freedom for my kids that I did growing up in DC. And they don't have that today. My kids can't even bike to our library because even though we have wide enough sidewalks, cars just are the primary mode and people are not paying attention. And my kids just don't feel safe. And I remember as a middle schooler, like riding the metro all day on Saturday because I could. It was cheap. And I could get on the bus, ride it to the end of the line, turn around and ride it home. I would jump off at Union Station and get lunch, and I would have a book with me. And I'm just thinking, like, what did that independence and freedom do for me And that's the same kind of freedom and independence that I want to give to my kids. But we don't have an equitable transit system that would allow that to be fully realized in the community and where I live. And that's the thing that I want to advocate for by speaking up in the spaces that I can to say, how are we thinking of other modes of transportation other than a car? Because that, as Molly has said already, kids can't drive and they should still have access to the city in the communities that we live in and that we love.
You know, I just want to jump in here quickly because we are coming on time rapidly. And this conversation is packed. And I think that we could go probably on for hours. So maybe I'll do a part 2. What I would love to hear is just, and Donnell, you talked about it, and I'm not sure if some of the rest of you have talked about it, but if we could close with just a quick note from each of you about what is like the primary policy advocacy issue that you're doing right now. And then I want to close us out with just talking about why this is relevant to social work, because I think one thing we've noticed is there's definitely different ideological approaches to this issue. But what we can agree upon and what is relevant to social work practice is the environment in which a person exists is so important, the built environment and the social environment, the invisible structures too. And as social workers, we got to kind of get in there and see what those environments are like before we can assess and help with other issues in a person's life. And we also have to help people and empower people to speak up in their own communities so they can reshape infrastructure if needed. So that was my point. But policy advocacy issues in closing.
I can jump in. One that I was working on just passed in Ann Arbor, which was setting a policy that for all of our roads in the city that are 4 lanes or more, to look at reconfiguring them to be narrower and to make space, which is like one of the most proven safety measures that you can make. To Idrees' point earlier, putting in bike lanes is often part of that reconfiguration, but it's not actually for bikers. It makes it safer for pedestrians to cross, and it makes it safer for drivers. And bikes are sort of last on that list. So that just happened. So thank you, Aisha, for that, because that was really exciting. And the next thing that I'm working on is much smaller and closer to home, which is there's an important street in my neighborhood that doesn't have a sidewalk that a lot of drivers use as a cut through. It's where the school bus stop is, and kids can't use it safely because they're too little, and drivers come whipping around these corners, and it looks like we're going to get a sidewalk. And so I've been working with my neighbors to sort of make sure that actually happens and to make sure that it does what we need it to. And I'm so excited, to Donnell's point, about what it's going to mean for my kids and their ability to access their friends without my intervention.
That's awesome. And thank you for the work you do. Anyone else want to close with some priority advocacy issues or things you think that social workers like need to hear?
This is Ruth. CDAD does a lot of work, and I work with a lot of our members, including Detroit Disability Power, and on a lot of different issues. So it'd be hard for me just to identify one or two, but I just want to say 2 framing things, and I'm sort of summarizing what I've said before and what's in my slides. I feel it's important that we design, maintain, and fund all streets for all users that are safe, accessible, and that everyone has full access to the options for transit and mobility that works for them. But also the second part of that is that more people would choose and have meaningful involvement in the public decision-making regarding transit and mobility and investments, but also understand transit and mobility decisions are affected by housing, economic development, community development, where we place schools, all that kind of stuff. But I just encourage your students, get involved and help other people get involved.
Get involved. Yes. Donnell or Idrees?
I can jump in real quick. I will say I'm not really actively involved in policy advocacy in my current role. You know, really since I've started, I've taken a break with a lot of the sort of advocacy work. But I am really excited to be working on the Joe Louis Greenway. I haven't really talked about what it is or what it does, so I'll just give you guys an overview of that project. We're building a 30-mile cycling and pedestrian trail around the city of Detroit. It will connect to existing assets like the Detroit Riverwalk and the DeQuinder Cut. You know, building a similar, you know, path is, I think, a good comparison is the DeQuinder Cut, but really connecting it to 23 neighborhoods across the city: Hamtramck, Highland Park, and the city of Dearborn. So 4 communities, 23 neighborhoods, and yeah, just really excited to be contributing to that project and helping it get done. We just had a ribbon cutting last week. If any of you are interested in checking out the first segment at our Warren Gateway Park, you can find it on Google if you search Joe Louis Greenway Warren Gateway. And that first mile is now complete, so you can actually walk and experience the Greenway if you want an idea of what it looks like and what it is. Yeah, but excited to be bringing green space to communities across the city, creating new ways to get around, connecting communities, and improving accessibility for Detroiters around the city.
Thank you.
I think my recommendation will be on the policy side. I think we hear from the people who don't want what policymakers are thinking about as the future of our communities. We don't often hear from the people who are using the infrastructure and the infrastructure that exists. And so we hear from people who don't want bike lanes. We don't often hear from people who need those bike lanes. In my community, I see a lot of folks who use their e-bikes as an alternative mode of transportation to a car because it's both cheaper and easier. They can always find a parking spot. They can generally move around the city very easily. But their voices aren't the voices that come to the policy and legislative tables. And so I would love to just encourage people to either take some of the recommendations that Ruth and others have said about bringing people into that process so that we don't have to resist these things, but we can actually co-create them and co-imagine them so that they benefit everybody. We definitely, I think, are on the same page with wanting to have access to safe streets and safe infrastructure. So figuring out what that means, and a lot of our like public hearings and the way that we've structured things don't actually facilitate that conversation as well. And I think there are folks who are within the social work community who are probably really experienced at having really difficult conversations. So, and being able to facilitate really difficult conversations so that people can feel heard and seen and valued for their contributions. And I would love to partner with anybody who would be interested in figuring out how to do that, especially if you're in Ann Arbor.
Yeah. I remember one thing you said, Donnell, at the start of this was like, encourage people to come to the Planning Commission. As a city council member, we get recommendations from the various commissions about policy. Donnell is a planning commissioner. Molly is on the Transportation Commission. I only got involved in city politics because I applied to be on a commission or a board of human rights. It is really, you can have a real impact on your city, and you can have an impact on the way the city is built. So I encourage folks on this call, apply to be on city boards and commissions. I wasn't anyone special. Anyone can do it. And encourage people who you're serving, your clients, to get involved and to take that power as well.
There's an opening on transportation right now. So
awesome. Yeah. We'll send that in the list of resources. I want to thank everyone, all the panelists, everyone who joined this call or this discussion. It was really amazing. It was really full. And panelists, please do send any resources that you want me to distribute, and I will make sure that everyone who has joined today gets them. I'm just going to give some quick engage notes or some follow-up reminders. We have our next session. It's not virtual, it's in person. It's on December 7th. Parker, if you can share your screen and just show a quick flyer. It's a panel called What Can You Do with Your MSW Degree? And we're asking former MSW alum who work in research, interpersonal practice, our politicians, community organizers. They're going to be panelists, and we're going to have someone come from NASW and talk about the recent advocacy going on at the legislative level to change licensing requirements and exam requirements. And also, what do you need to know about licensing? So December 7th, School of Social Work, please join us. And that's it. I think we're going to wrap up the conversation today. If students from Engage could stay on for a quick debrief, that would be great. Thanks everyone for coming.